In this lecture, we'll be looking or taking a closer look at trauma as it relates to the skeletal anatomy. In our last lecture, we looked at blunt force trauma and some of the mechanics associated with what happens to bone tissues when, in this case, tensile strength is being overcome by some sort of unnatural external force. In this lecture, we'll start out by looking at sharp force trauma, and then we'll move into gunshot wounds. For the record, gunshot wounds do or are classified as a type of blunt force trauma. But let's begin by looking at sharp force trauma. When classifying or categorizing injuries as they relate to skeletal evidence or one's skeletal anatomy, there's really four things that we have to consider when we are looking at, in this case, the injury itself. And again, in this slide, you can see some cleaned up examples of the kind of three major categories that we're covering as part of this lecture series. First, you identify something or you look at the shape of the wound itself, and that really will distinguish between these three areas, whether you're dealing with a blunt force type or if you're dealing with sharp force trauma, and I'll cover that after I get through this list. Next, you look at the length of the wound. This gives you an idea of the kind of weapon, the kind of object that is incorporated into the injury or the death event. You look at the depth of the wound itself, whether or not it's, in this case, completely severing bone tissue, whether it's doing that or not, whether or not it is creating some sort of internal injury or some sort of bone plug, or the fracture pattern itself. And then the kind of fourth category, the direction and force of the injury. And this will, in a sense, take the forensic examination that you're giving of the skeletal evidence and expand that to incorporate even the crime scene itself and the players that exist within that criminological event or a series of events which may lead up to that. So the shape of the wound, the length of the wound, the depth of the wound, and then the direction and force. Now, when you're looking specifically at sharp force trauma, there's a variety of action-related categories that we place sharp force trauma into. There are injuries associated with stabbing. There are injuries associated with slashing movements or motions. There are incised kinds of injuries. And then there are the typical kinds of chopping injuries. And the hatchet class that we're looking at in this image falls into this chopping category within sharp force trauma types. Now, when you're talking about sharp force trauma in general, and again, the hatchet class or any sort of chopping action is going to be, I think, the best example for understanding sharp force trauma. This is a kind of traumatic event that is caused by objects that have some sort of strong angle to their surface. If you think about metal objects, the corners of metal objects or objects that have some sort of blade-like quality to them, these would produce the kind of injury that we see here. And this is a pretty extreme version, cranial version of a sharp force traumatic event. Sharp force lesions will form in both soft and hard tissues, but they are best known for incising those tissue types, so cutting directly through them, providing us with this comminuted, completely dissected kind of fracture pattern. If you have fractures that develop around a wound environment and they are associated with, in this case, a sharp force traumatic event, generally what we will see with regard to these kinds of fracture patterns in the bone tissue, specifically compact bone, is you will see a lot of terminal depression fracture patterns that will radiate out and around in a spider-like form the kind of elongated injury environment, or kind of where the force is being directed. Again, it's much more elongated in a sharp force event, and around this elongated event, this almost linear fracture that would be deep and extremely penetrative, around that you'll start to see a variety of terminal depression fractures forming. And these themselves can be pretty extreme as well. The presence and degree of radiating or spider web fracture patterns relates a great deal to the bone type and bone tissue type that you are looking at, and the degree to which you have other kinds of bone tissues like spongy bone tissue associated with that area of the skeletal anatomy. So that's something that, again, is very, very characteristic of sharp force lesions and sharp force trauma in skeletal evidence. Now, the kind of injury that we see here is typical of that chopping wound type, and it is typical of the kinds of chopping wounds that you would see as associated with flat bone of the neurocranium. So bones associated in this case with the cranium itself, or if you're including the mandible, the skull itself. When you're talking about a chopping wound to the head and you are dealing with some sort of weapon that fits into an axe or hatchet class, as this does, what you basically are going to start to see are characteristics in the wound itself that tell you something about the shape of the blade, the size of the blade, the linear nature of the blade, and then, of course, the degree of force that's being exerted as that blade is coming into contact with the victim. And here we have three events that are caught up into one criminal action or criminal event. And when you think about the sequence here, you have to kind of move backwards. The initial strike is occurring from behind, and that's identified with the letter C. Then it moves as the individual is kind of falling and twisting forward, or turning their head as they're falling forward. Then you're catching the edge of that blade environment, and that creates a strong incision at the top of the skull. And then as the person then rotates, again, further falling, getting closer to the ground, then you have this third blow, which again is very, very strong and probably has the strongest expression just because of the amount of tissue disruption that is kind of visualized in this example. Then you have B as the kind of the final blow here, which jettisons a good amount of that ectocranial surface endocranially. Now, when you're talking about any sort of traumatic injury like this, or like what we're seeing here, you have to consider the manner of the injury itself. So very often injuries will be further classified into homicidal classes, non-homicidal or accidental classes. There will be defensive injuries where you have maybe a conflict between two individuals, and then you of course have injuries that are directed to injure the individual, but then you also have that individual defending himself or herself, and those additional defensive injuries can occur in this case as well. And then you have self-inflicted kinds of injuries that can be associated with any traumatic event. In this case, what we're looking at is a definite homicidal example. And then one last detail, when you're looking at the actual injury itself and the path of the injury, or what you're looking at in terms of that kind of those linear, very strong breaks in the skull itself, you're also getting a sense of kerf, K-E-R-F. Kerf is an expression or a term that relates to grooves or breaks in the skeletal material that tell you something about the shape of, in this case, the cutting surface or the metal edge that's associated with the sharp force object, in this case the hatchet class object. Now let's turn our attention to gunshot wound interpretation. In this case, we're going to take a look at different kinds of wounds and then how to interpret some of the evidence associated with them. When you're looking at gunshot wound injuries, we recognize in forensics two types of gunshots to an individual. In this case, penetrating and perforating. So penetrating wounds, these occur when the bullet is entering an object but does not exit that object. And then we have perforating wounds, which are situations where you have the bullet entering the individual and then, of course, exiting it as well. And so, the force and the direction associated with, in this case, the bullet is going to be very, very important for how and why these particular kinds of gunshot wounds occur. To give you a little bit of a background on some of the terminology associated with, in this case, the gun technology itself, let me just define for you a couple of these terms. Of course, a gun is going to be any sort of device using either a pressurized gas or some sort of mechanical energy rather, to form a projectile through a tube and expel it out one end. A firearm, this is a gun that uses a spark or flame to ignite some sort of powder charge that releases gas as it burns. Revolvers, these are handguns. They're characterized by a revolving cylinder containing numerous fire chambers. Rifles, these are firearms with rifled barrels designed to fire from the shoulder. Pistols, so a pistol is a self-loading handgun, the ammunition for which is contained in some sort of removable spring-loaded magazine. Shotguns, shotgun injury is associated with a shotgun. A shotgun is a weapon intended to be fired from the shoulder as well. It's smooth, it'll have usually a smooth bore barrel, and it's designed to fire multiple pellets of some sort or multiple projectiles. Now, when you start looking at the weapons themselves, then you start to assess things like rifling. Rifling is associated with the grooving that is found within the length of a barrel of a gun internally. Rifling will be important for understanding or matching a bullet with a weapon of some sort. Again, each barrel is unique in terms of its rifling, and the markings that it leaves on a bullet are also very, very unique. And then terms like ballistics. What does ballistics mean? Ballistics is a study. It's a study of a projectile in flight, and then it has different kinds of expressions to how that projectile is being studied. You have internal ballistics, looking how it's traveling through a gun barrel. You have external ballistics, focusing on the projectile's flight from the gun muzzle or the muzzle of a gun. And then you have things like terminal ballistics. This deals with the path that the projectile takes through a target, so on and so forth. So there's all kinds of nuances to understanding the weapon and how to categorize or classify the weapon, or then applying, in this case, how we are studying the projectile. And then, of course, it connects to these ideas of understanding something about the wound track itself, and then classifying it as either penetrating or perforating in nature. So this particular image here, it's somewhat disturbing, but important when you're looking at different kinds of injuries in both soft and hard tissue. Here we see extensive fracturing and tissue loss that results from an intraoral gunshot wound, self-inflicted. It's considered to be a kind of atypical gunshot wound, and we'll talk about this in just a moment. And again, the damage we're seeing here results from the expulsion of gas and projectiles from the barrel within very close kind of or confined space, in this case the mouth and the skull. So this is a pretty good example of an atypical gunshot wound injury, and again it would be considered to be a perforating type of wound track. Let's distinguish now between typical and atypical kinds of gunshot wound injuries, and then of course this would relate to how we're interpreting the gunshot wound itself and its morphology. What I'm doing here is I'm listing out some important characteristics, and then what I'll do is as I move through these characteristics, I'll expand some of these ideas and add some additional terms and ideas to each one of them as we go. Not all of them, but for some of them, there will be some additional information that I'll share with you. So as you can see here, when we're talking about typical kinds of gunshot wound injuries, the first thing we have to do is talk about the location of the injury itself. Now, for a moment, kind of ignore the image that's associated with this slide. We'll come back to this image because this is more of an atypical wound, and so it would not fit into the typical class or typical group of gunshot wound injuries, as would our interpretation. We would interpret this as really a little bit differently in terms of what kind of characteristics we are studying. But when it's typical, we start out with anatomical location, and we examine the wound, we examine the damage to soft and hard tissue, and record as much as we possibly can. Next, we take a look at the number of shots that are being fired. And we talk a little bit about whether or not this is a gunshot wound event that's traumatic, that's associated with a single wound or a single event, or if it's multiple. Third, we look at distance or range, and this is the first one that I want to kind of develop here a little more strongly. When we're talking about the range of fire, it is the distance between the muzzle of the weapon and where the projectile is striking an object, or in this case, an individual. There's a lot of different interpretations that go into distance or range of fire. With contact gunshot wounds, the muzzle is in full contact with the skin or is very, very close to the skin, maybe directly up against clothing at the time of discharge. And when this occurs, you are going to get things referred to as tattooing. This is where you have almost a gunpowder burn to underlying skin tissue. Those things, though, that are just above the bone tissue that we're looking at for this course. Or you might have something referred to as stippling, stippling, stippling. This is also a kind of tattooing effect where you have a star-shaped pattern actually on the skin itself, and that tells you that the muzzle is in contact or near contact with the remains. Going back to distance for a moment, the term near contact, sometimes referred to as loose contact. This indicates the muzzle was not in physical contact with the skin, but within 10 to 20 millimeters of the skin surface. Contact, again, at or near wounds is very, very noticeable because we get that kind of muzzle stamp through the tattooing that occurs there. There are two other kinds of range-related terms that you should associate with distance. Intermediate range gunshot wounds occur when the muzzle of the weapon is not in direct contact with the body, but is discharged close enough to cause powder to be, in this case, sprayed onto the clothing or to the skin itself. Sometimes with intermediate range gunshot wounds, there can even be a little bit of tattooing, so it's pretty close. And then you have the long range kind of gunshot wounds. The sole markings or defects on the skin are those produced by the bullet itself or by the projectile itself. There's no soot or tattooing or any other indications of propellants as being present, or anything associated with propellants that can be recorded. So those are the kinds of terms that you would want to associate with distance or range as they relate to firing, the firing of a weapon in this case. Then we should talk a little bit about direction as it relates to a typical kind of wound associated again with a gunshot wound injury. The bullet's path or its direction is established by differentiating entrance and exit wounds. Again, if you have penetrating or perforating, you will want to distinguish that as well. Penetration mechanics explain how bone reacts to projectiles. Bullets penetrating bone result in a plug and spall kind of bone injury, which we'll see in the next slide. The plug forms or its formation occurs when the bone fails to shear, or it will respond to very strong tensile strength or tensile forces and will result in this kind of bone plug developing. The bone literally punches out an entrance in the bone structure itself. So again, the direction becomes another important characteristic, and we focus on looking at entrance and exit wounds. The size of the tissue disruption is another typical kind of characteristic that you would want to record when you're talking about an entrance or exit wound that's associated with, let's say, the thorax. Again, it's going to disrupt quite a bit of tissue just because of the sheer amount of tissue that's associated with that region of the body. The thorax, again, being that portion of the body that incorporates the thoracic cavity, and of course, a good amount of the vertebral column, including portions of the kind of lower section of the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae. But when you think about the contents within that thoracic cavity, within the rib cage itself, there's a lot of tissue in there, and there's a great deal of tissue disruption that occurs when a bullet enters that space, enters and potentially exits that space as well. And so you want to, again, take a very close look at that, and the autopsy will do that. Then you have the projectile itself, and that's where we want to estimate caliper. And so there's a few ideas that I want to attach to the notion of caliper, and this will help, again, flush out some of the characteristics that we're looking at with regard to typical wound morphology. So in terms of the term caliper, what does this actually mean? So in the United States, the caliper of a gun is generally determined by the diameter of the bore. And again, you have to think about the design of the muzzle, the design of, in this case, that portion of the gun through which the bullet is traveling. The caliper can be defined in terms of the bullet. It can be defined in terms of the markings on the bullet itself, or the groovings, or the rifling that's associated with that bullet. But generally, the caliper will relate most closely to the firing bore, what it's traveling through, and the diameter of that firing bore. Now, when you're talking about ammunition, and you're talking about the bullet itself, there's a lot of additional terms and ideas that you can assign to this. Firearm ammunition comes in really two basic forms. You have cartridges, and then you have shot shells. So what are those? Well, cartridges consist of a casing. There's usually a primer in there, there's a propellant or a gunpowder, and then of course the projectile or the bullet. Casings typically are made out of brass. They expand to seal the chamber to prevent the rearward kind of escape of gases, so you don't want it to backfire on you. So it's a very precisely made kind of space that contains, in this case, gunpowder. And inside of that, you'll have a primer, you'll have different kinds of gunpowders, they'll have different kinds of burning rates. So there's all kinds of different concepts or terms that can be assigned to that. Now, in terms of the projectile itself, there are characteristics that an individual, an investigator, has to start considering as they're recovering these kinds of projectiles, and trying to get a sense of the kind of gun that is being used, or firearm that's being used in the criminological event. You have probably heard some of these terms because they have been popularized, and we live in a very much of a gun culture. So guns are very, very common throughout the United States, as are some of the terms associated with them. But in terms of the projectiles themselves, you have things like hollow points. Hollow point is a projectile with a nose cavity that will increase or expand upon impact. So sometimes you'll see a kind of a softer metal, a lead or lead mixture associated with the point itself. Um, in that same vein, you have things like soft points or soft point projectiles. These have noses that will, um, again, expand on impact, and these will have quite a bit of exposed lead that's associated with them, so they won't have a depression, but it'll be a closed point or nose, and it will consist of a soft metal, in this case lead. Then you have full or total metal jackets, in which the core of the bullet is encased in a metal covering or jacket. So it looks like an actual projectile. And again, it's not going to change as it moves through the air or as it moves through some sort of material or is impacting an object. So it's a full or total metal jacket. And then you have something referred to as a black talon, Talon, or armor piercing kind of projectile. These are designed to penetrate body armor and to maximize lethal injury. And so these are things that, again, are designed in such a way as to pierce through pretty strong material as they engage it. So those are all terms or ideas associated with the caliper of a projectile and then the projectile itself. Of course, I haven't even mentioned shotgun shells or any of that and how that's designed, but needless to say, that would be another area of evidence to assign to caliper and what comes next, which is again bullet type. So if you're dealing with a shotgun shell and you're dealing with projectiles and some sort of wadded material, and of course the propellant itself, all of those are characteristics that you would be collecting evidence on as well. So the caliper, all right, the diameter of that firing bore, the type of bullet you're looking at, if it's a projectile, again, is it hollow point, soft point, full or total metal jacket, or if it is one of these very unique armor piercing kinds of projectile types. And then finally you have the wound itself. And in this image you see that plug and spall kind of production having to do with the wound track and indirectly the direction of the projectile. So let me just again build on this just a little bit. So again, when you're talking about bullets penetrating bone, you get this plug formation and the spall production. Plug formation occurs when the bone fails to shear in response to a strong tensile force. The bullet initially punches out an entrance, forming a plug, and then blows out an exit, producing the spall. The spalling produces the beveling or the cone-shaped defect that characterizes exit wounds. And so when you take a look at the bottom image there, this is a rib. When you look at the top image there, you see the external markings, plug in this case, right? What is being punched out at the entrance. And then in the lower image, this is internal, or you're looking at the injury from that medial surface, so it's facing inward. This is the spall, and the spalling produces that beveling or that cone-shaped defect. The presence of wipe is also something, W-I-P-E, wipe is also something important, but that is seen as under magnification in this case. The soft projectiles will penetrate tissue and will leave behind these minute fragments, and they will also, again, point toward the direction that the projectile is going. With the spall in this case, the bone spur that you can kind of see there as well as the shape of the spall. That's kind of showing you the direction. It's pointing in the direction that the projectile is moving. So you have the plug, you have the spall. The spall is pointing in the direction, moving, in this case, from outside of the body, moving through the rib, and then moving toward where the sternum is, in a sense. And then if we were to look under this, or at this under magnification, we would see those tiny, soft fragments of metal that are literally being wiped off onto the tissue, and they're calling it wipe. And those will also give you an orientation as to the direction of the bullet. So all of these characteristics are things that would be associated with a typical kind of wound morphology. Atypical is a little different. So let me bring back the original slide for a moment. This keyhole defect that we see in the image, this kind of unique shape here in the cranial bone, is or fits more of that atypical gunshot wound morphology. This is where we have foreign objects or projectiles that are spinning because of some sort of interaction with air turbulence, or some sort of other media that is causing a projectile to spin. Sometimes with long range gunshots that are associated with a rifle, you can get a spinning that occurs before it strikes the individual. This would produce this kind of keyhole defect, but really any sort of foreign object that has an unusual position as it relates to the body and the gunshot itself, they will produce these atypical kinds of defects. And so let me just dwell on this keyhole defect for a moment and get this into your notes and expose you to these ideas. So with regard to a keyhole defect, investigators are looking at material. They notice what appears to be an entrance or an exit defect that is very hard to determine a source. So it doesn't look like a typical kind of plug and spall expression. Keyhole defects are wounds that occur when a bullet strikes, let's say, the skull or some sort of material, or when you have a foreign object like shrapnel striking cranial material, or some other part of the body. Usually flat bones will give you this kind of expression. It's striking it at an angle that's uncommon to how a bullet or projectile would strike the remains. The margins of the defect show usually some sort of internal beveling, and then it would give you this almost keyhole-like appearance in terms of the entrance of the wound. And we would see this as being just, again, an atypical kind of wound injury. And so there's a variety of other considerations that we have to look more closely at. We have to look at hidden exits. We have to look at different kinds of expressions having to do with what are referred to as shored exit wounds. These are where you, again, are getting some sort of very odd exit to a perforating wound, where maybe something that's being worn by the individual or something that the individual is leaning against will change the morphology of the exit wound. So there's all kinds of very atypical kinds of characteristics that we have to consider as we're trying to understand the path, the distance, even the caliper of the material, or whatever object such as shrapnel that's striking the body, and how it's striking the body. So it brings up another series of considerations that we have to add to this typical list, or things that may not even be able to be addressed by the typical list when we're dealing with what kind of projectile is being or is interacting with the remains in this case. And then I'll just share with you this final example. Again, I've hit you with a lot, so make sure to pause the lecture at a variety of locations and get down some of those additional terms and ideas that are not necessarily mapped out on the slides. And I think you'll find that there's quite a bit of information that you can pull out of the lecture as part of that process. But here we have a typical kind of plug and spall exit wound as it relates to cranial bone. You can see in this case that the projectiles are leaving the skull. We have two projectiles in this case. They're leaving the skull at a direction generally from right to left through the cranial cavity, and they're exiting in areas of suturing. So these areas where you have flat bones of the neurocranium actively unifying, or areas of union between bones of the neurocranium, these are potential areas of weakness. And so we see that there's fracturing that's occurring, in this case more lateral to those suture areas, but then the sutures themselves become a part of that spall that is then being lost, or is moving externally to the individual. So the two projectiles are moving from left to right. They're coming in just behind the oral and optical areas within the viscerocranium, or the face in this case. They are moving into and through the endocranium, and then they are exiting through, in this case, the back of the skull, and they create these very unique kinds of breaks where the plug is developing, and then its spall, it is in a sense leaving the remains in this case. And again, when it's moving from right to left, you can see that many of the angular breaks in that spall are pointing to the left side of that body. So it's entering through the oral cavity, and of course through part of the face, and then it's moving through that cranial cavity, and then it's exiting out, and it has that kind of angle right to left that is developing, in this case in the occipital region of the skull. So some major takeaways from our brief discussion of gunshot wound injuries. Again, you have typical and atypical, you have perforating and penetrating, and then within those major categories, you have a lot of different characteristics of the projectiles themselves, the firearms, the guns, the pistols that are a source for those projectiles, some of the manufacturing qualities to those weapons, and then you have the physics and the dynamics of that criminal scene environment, where you have the location of where that gun is and where the remains are, or the objects that the projectiles are interacting with eventually, where they are in that environment. You have distance, you have direction, and then of course based upon that you have force. A lot of similarities to what we were seeing with blunt force trauma, and then at the beginning of this lecture with sharp force trauma, in terms of being able to understand something about the direction of the wound path itself, and then some of the characteristics as to the wound morphology. All of these have to be considered, recorded, and taken into consideration when you are trying to reconstruct some sort of violent event that is associated with trauma, or this unnatural kind of deformation that we see, both to the skeletal anatomy, but then also to some of that surrounding tissue, and even some of the internal tissue as well.